I would like to tell you a little story about my time as youth representative. Because back in 2019, I visited a conference in New York at the headquarters of the United Nations, which was the United Nations Climate Action Summit. Now, I remember this conference very well. It was a very hectic one. Almost all heads of state were present here. And, the place was also crawling with business leaders, diplomats, politicians, other youth representatives like myself. And whenever there was a big conference like that one, the ambassador of every country would always, at some point, host a fancy dinner at their house where they would invite other people to come and, meet each other there. And honestly, I very much liked it because at some point I would be growing very tired of all the supermarket food that I was whipping myself up between conference days every day. So at some point, we also received an invitation in our inbox from the ambassador of the Netherlands. So I went up there to that dinner, had a lovely dinner, and then at some point, after the dinner, I was just looking around at all the people present, and that is when I saw a man with neatly combed gray hair. He was somewhere in his late 50s, and he was wearing a gray jacket. And it took me a couple of seconds to realize that that man was the CEO of one of the largest oil companies in the world. So, I was there at that stage in time. I was also at the peak of my worry when it comes to the climate crisis. So I saw this man who had the potential to make incredible changes if he wanted to. So before I knew it, I was walking over to him, and then I stood before him, and I asked him what he was planning to do at this conference. And I can distinctly remember, honestly, I was genuinely curious to hear from him what he was planning to do at the conference. And I can remember that he took a moment to look me up and down. He adjusted the lapels of his gray, very expensive probably, jacket. He took a moment for another pause, and then he finally said, well, climate action is the purpose of our company. It is incredibly important to us. And I hear you laughing. I had to refrain from laughing at that moment. But when he said that, as quickly as he told me about how important climate action was to the purpose of his company and how badly it was important for them to join in on the conversation about climate action, as quickly as he told me all of that, he also whipped up his arm, looked at his watch and said, oh, you know what? It's already getting very late. I need to head to bed to rest because I have a long day tomorrow, but it was nice meeting you. And then he left off. And I stood there with, a million more questions that I wanted to ask him, but I was unable to do so. Guys, I don't know if you realize what he's doing, but I was ghosted in real life by this man, honestly. This is like the real life version of, the blue ticks on WhatsApp. I'm being left on red by him. But in all honesty, this was at a stage in time where I was genuinely, and still am genuinely worried about the state where we are with the climate crisis. Back then in 2019, we had just 11 years to avert a climate catastrophe, and now we have just shy of 8 years to do so. And I had also understood at that point that climate action is not some form of charity work that we're doing to save the bumblebees and butterflies, but it is rather a last attempt to save ourselves. So, in all seriousness, we see the deepening droughts, we see the growing deserts, the drying up of the crops, and we know that if we do not act now, they will inevitably lead to fatal famine, to conflicts over the last drops of fresh water, and to climate refugees as well in the end. So there I stood as a 19-year-old, and I saw one of the most influential people within this field of arena move away swiftly from that conversation. And it left me wondering, this purpose that he was speaking about, was it really enough to get us where we needed to be to avert that climate crisis? Now, in the spirit of friendship and laughter, I see some friendly faces here in the public looking at me. I'm going to share some of the other overwhelming thoughts I had whilst being at this conference, because this first one was, how are we going to make it? But another one that I had, another very, anxious thought I had whilst being at this conference, which had nothing to do with it, was the looming presence of an accounting exam I would have to take the day after I would get back to the Netherlands. Because you see, the day before I left for New York to attend that conference, I remember being in my own bedroom and packing my suitcase, and then I noticed that my financial accounting book was lying on my desk, and I knew and realized in that instance that when I got back, I would have to take that test. So, of course, I panicked, and I thought, what am I going to do? And in some sort of desperate attempt, I picked up that 10-kilo weighing financial accounting book, I slammed it into my suitcase and forced it in there, there, trusting myself to find time during the conference days and weekends to take it out and study for the exam. So, you know, two very, very, very scary things, right? The imminent threat of a climate catastrophe on the one hand, and then my own accounting exam at the other side. But, you know, the Climate Action Summit, it started on that Monday, and I remember waking up very early. I got dressed, put on the most uncomfortable set of boots I owned, and ventured out on my way to the international headquarters of the United Nations. Now, once I got there, I walked up the steps of the building, showed the security guard who stood there my delegate's badge, and he nudged me in without so much so as averting his eyes from the blue pass that was hanging around my neck. Once I got inside the building, it was crowded with people. So I maneuvered my way through the bustling hallways on my way to the General Assembly Hall, find a seat, sat down and placed my bag on the beige carpet floor, waiting with great expectations for the conference to start. And it did. Soon enough, the room filled itself up with speeches from world leaders and business leaders speaking about raising awareness and striving to deepen our knowledge. Hypnotized, I listened to words like, "Dear Madam Chair," and another thing that was very often mentioned, people saying, you know, all the young people out there protesting on the streets, they give us so much hope. But there was one other statement that was recurringly mentioned, and it was a familiar one. It was where people said, we have to act with purpose. There it is again, the same thing that the CEO mentioned to me during that delegation dinner earlier that week. Now, that evening, when I got back to my room, I stayed at a youth hostel that was so small. I see my colleague sitting over there. She knows what I'm talking about. But it was so small. You stepped in and turned. You could not fully open your suitcase on the floor. But I got in there, I put on my pajamas, and I sat down at the small wooden desk that did just nearly fit in the room. And I opened that big, fat accounting exam book that I had to study. But that night, I remember that I could do anything but studying, because all I was doing in my mind was going over everything that had happened that day, everything that was said, everything that was shared. And you know, in the end, the only thing that I could really remember through studying was the most rudimentary, the most basics of accounting principles, which is this one. Revenue minus expenses equals profit. That was the stellar knowledge I was left with. So you get money as a company, those are your revenues. You pay for your costs, those are your expenses. What you're left with is what you get to keep, those are your profits. So, you know, with that stellar and, mind you, magnificent level of knowledge, I woke up the next day and I started all over again. And my days continued in such a fashion. I woke up, I attended more panels, discussions, I organized events, I gave speeches, I talked to people, I got back home to that tiny hostel room, I studied a bit, I went to bed, woke up, listened to more business leaders talk about purpose and sustainability, and then it went on and on and on until one evening when I was seated at that same wooden desk in my room, and I was actually paying good attention for the first time to my accounting course, when I realized that I was in the tales of two cities. Because during the day, I was a youth representative. I was trying to talk to these business leaders to get them to actually act in line with their purpose. But then at night, I was a business student myself, and I was teaching myself this accounting system that solely looks at the financial value of a company. I was teaching myself to use the exact same systems that they are using. So, you know, in all of those profit and loss statements, you know, the ones that go revenue minus expenses equal profits, nowhere in the list of expenses was there a penny paid for deforestation, for the chemicals and toxins put into our atmosphere, or usually also not for the carbon emitted into the air or other greenhouse gases. And here is the painful truth. These costs will be paid for, but if not by companies now, then they will be paid for by our generation in the form of floods, in the form of droughts, in the form of climate-induced famine, and in the form even eventually of environmental deaths. So is it weird that with our current accounting system there is so much pollution in the air? Is it weird that factory workers work in inhumane conditions, that deforestation is happening at this annihilating rate? Quite honestly, it is not, right? If we're honest, we know that it's not. Now, I think also in the spirit of honesty, as I'm standing here and as we've established that we are in the spirit of love and friendship, sharing everything, when I got back to the Netherlands, I failed that accounting exam big time. But very much big time, it actually butchered me. But you know, it wouldn't be until a couple of years later that I'd realize that I wasn't the only one failing at accounting. The accounting system was failing us too. Now, I am perfectly aware of the fact that that sounds like a made-up excuse by some sixth grader to tell their parents as to why they didn't pass their exams. But honestly, maybe I needed a little excuse, but honestly, it is the truth. The accounting standards are failing us. And now I also want to say, because I experienced this and I have friends who experienced this, whenever anyone mentions the word accounting itself, I know that it can feel like, you know, the most boring thing in the world that you could ever hear of, but I promise you what I'm about to tell you, it's actually quite juicy. So I promise you there will be juice for you in this talk towards the end, so bear with me, okay? Now, what is important for us to understand is that the current accounting system does not reflect the true value of a company. And that is problematic for two major reasons. So first off, we've already established we do not pay up for the cost that we have to society. But the other effect, the other major problem, which is often overlooked, works on a financial level. Because it is, on a financial level, extremely important that we reflect the true value of a company. You know how many businesses there are as of today that are dealing with stranded assets, assets that lose all the value just like that, just in a split second, because they have not calculated in the climate risks to the assets that they own. That CEO that I mentioned at the beginning, just, I think, like shy of a half year later, I read in the newspaper, that his company had to forcibly write off $22 billion off their balance sheet, just like that, disappearing because they had not calculated in the climate risks to their company. Because honestly, it is a very big company and they have a lot of financial value, but they have very low environmental value, they have low social value. So this needs to be represented, because if this is happening to countries all over the economy, to companies all over the economy, then that is an actual hazard to the stability of it. Now, I know that I promised you juice, and where juice is promised, juice shall be delivered. Because you might be wondering, how do we go about changing that accountancy standard? At least I would be wondering at this point. And the answer to that is actually incredibly interesting. It has everything to do with just these 10 people right here. You see them, a very young, fresh-looking team of people. Because these 10 people here could change the accounting standard if they would want to. They have the power to do so. Because you see, this is the board that is responsible for the IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standard. That is an accounting standard that decides for more than 140 countries how they have to account, how those companies have to account. And you know, there are 41,000 listed companies in the world that have to abide by accounting standards. If we could get these companies to see environmental impact, negative environmental impact, for example, as actual costs and subtract it from their profit to pay up for deforestation, for pollution, that would lead to lower profit. And if we could get them to do that, then we can create a system where it will be literally within the interests of companies to lower their negative impact on the environment, because that will literally result in a higher profit. And they could then still go on to maximize their profit, but we could change the entire system in that way. So it is them that we need to get there to change the accounting standard so that we can get companies to treat social and environmental cost and impact and value just as equally as financial value is. Now, I mentioned IFRS. There is another accounting standard as well, which is called GAAP, US GAAP. It's for the United States. They have an accounting standard just for themselves because they love to be special. But you know what I find very interesting about the GAAP standard is what it stands for, because the abbreviation literally stands for Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. Now, when I read this, the first thing I thought of was generally accepted by whom? By the boomers, maybe, by the 10 people in that IFRS board. I'm not sure. But what I am sure of is that I think that if I speak for most people, I think most people would not generally accept a standard that excludes the impact that it has on the environment, on people, on humans, on nature of the world. And we can literally decide to change that. Now, I mentioned a couple of times today already that we will do everything in the spirit of love and friendship, so I will be honest with you as well. It is not easy to change this standard, but it is possible. And even more than that, it is necessary. You know, there are many groups and people out there who have already developed full frameworks about how we can, you know, include environmental and social value on our balance sheets, on our profit and loss statements. You have the impact-weighted accounts framework, for example, and many other more. Now, I also mentioned at the start that another one of the fan favorite statements that was mentioned during that conference was that people were saying, you know, all these super influential business people, by the way, they are super influential world leaders, business people, and they are saying, all those young people out there on the streets, you give me so much hope. And even some of them would even end by saying, please do keep holding us accountable, hold us accountable, go out in the streets and protests. But guys, that's a burden. It's not some gift of acknowledgement, it is a burden. You know how many young people I've met in these past years that dedicate their entire life to this cause, and you can see the burden weighing down so heavily of them, of trying to hold everyone accountable. And we should actually create a system in which young people don't have to do this, in which we are not coining terms such as climate anxiety or climate depression that people are experiencing. Now, if we can change the accounting standard, it will make sure that when all those other young people and I, for example, are around in the year 2100, because that is the horizon that we should be looking at. If we are around in 2100 and we are at another delegation dinner and we bump into another big shot CEO of some companies, then first off, I hope that CEO doesn't run away, but I especially hope that we will not have to feel the burden of holding them accountable with our questions, because then we can trust that accountability has been accounted for in the systems that we've created. Thank you.